Okay. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. My name is David Montejano. I'm the director of the Center for Latino Policy Research. And today we are happy to be hosting Cary Cordova and celebrating her book on the heart of the mission. Now, full disclosure, I have to do this.
Yeah, you got to.
I was on our dissertation committee many years ago when we were both young. In any case, this has been a long time in the coming, and that's why we're delighted to finally be hosting Cary Cordova to talk about Latino art and politics in San Francisco. So I'll let Cary give you all the details.
All right, okay, well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for hosting me, for welcoming me. My special thanks to David Montejano for being so patient. I'm waiting till now to bring me here. And thank you, Avia Varón, for organizing. And very happy to be here. And it is funny to be invited by a former committee member of the dissertation, because I know like one of the critiques was, we're the lowriders and there are still no lowriders in the work, so you can consider that I've left that out, but I just couldn't fit it. There's so much stuff. Today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about, I'm going to be drawing from the book, I'm going to be drawing from some maybe current events, and in some ways I feel like addressing the audience in Berkeley, California about stories about eviction and gentrification, there's a lot of familiarity, right? So I hate to tell you things that you might already know, but I also wanted to maybe preface where I'm headed a little bit, and I thought it was worth just sort of thinking about some of the statistics that we're dealing with here, and sort of thinking about in 2013, one of the moments for me of just enormous transformation is in the San Francisco Bay Area when the median house price becomes $1 million, right? And I mean, that just speaks so much to who can afford to buy a home in the ways in which it's clearly not an opportunity for a working class. And sort of at that same time, of course, rental prices are skyrocketing, and we see evictions happening. And so between 2010 and 2014, we know that evictions go from 1,200 to close to 2,000 a year, right? So that's about a 56% increase that we're thinking about in terms of evictions. And one of the other things just to sort of bear in mind in terms of thinking about how evictions are different at this moment is it's not that people aren't paying their rent. They're paying their rent. But the speculation is happening such that people are being pushed out of their homes through a number of different techniques by property owners. And we could talk about that more after. For right now, I would like to open with what I hope is a sort of interesting case. It's actually not in my book, but it sort of follows my book. And talking about in 2014 when artist Yolanda Lopez was facing eviction, and I do talk about this in my epilogue a bit, from her Mission District apartment that she had been living in for decades, right? This was not her first time facing the threat of eviction, but the threat was looming much more seriously. And let's just bear that in mind. It's not her first time facing the threat of eviction. She had been facing eviction for easily a decade, and sort of bearing that in mind in terms of threat and trauma and anxiety in terms of your living space. However, at this moment, it became clear that she needed to create a plan of what to do with her things and what she needed to de-acquisition. And so in collaboration with her son, Rio Yanez, also an artist, Lopez opted to hold a different kind of garage sale, an eviction sale, which she entitled Accessories to an Eviction, right? And she has now told me that Accessories to an Eviction was definitely a reference to sort of crime novels, right? So you can think about that. She held it at the Red Poppy Art House in San Francisco's Mission District, and she envisioned the sale much like a gallery installation, right? Curating her wares, and you can see how carefully things were sort of lined up, very much like in a gallery. But of course, selling these goods that were secondhand goods, and also juxtaposing the question as to whether there was, was this art, was this secondhand, where did this material exist? Nearby, she created a murder board, right, out of her eviction papers. And this mixed media collage of materials pointed at the ways the sale was not of her own volition, but rather the product of her evictor, Sergio Iantorno, the owner of Golden Properties and his law firm, Zach and Friedman. Lopez and fellow artist Adriana Camarena worked together to create this murder board. It was initially part of the home studio exhibition at the Mission Cultural Center a couple of months earlier, and then was also placed into the accessories for eviction sale. I thought I would read you a little bit about what Camarena says about creating the murder board. Yolanda had spoken to her friend Judy Drummond about a problem they were having for exposing the responsible parties in the midst of the layers of eviction papers, right? The layers of eviction papers, I just love that phrasing. Judy suggested that we use a murder board, like those used in Castle or Criminal Minds, to visually pinpoint the responsible parties in the eviction. Suddenly, we had a crime scene on our hands, and a way to clearly depict evictees, eviction scene, weapon, suspects, other persons of interest, and outstanding questions. While Yolanda directed the overall flow and placement of the pieces, I started arranging the murder board collage, and we agreed to add audio to the piece to emphasize the murder mystery story. And I believe Rio Yanez contributed the audio for that, so it was a multi-artist collaboration. In this way, the installation also became a dynamic visual protest. The scene represented Lopez's artistic and moral integrity alongside the unethical shenanigans of her landlord and the sheer absurdity of having to box up her life with nowhere affordable to go. Camarena recalled Yolanda's inimitable strength while they installed the show, claiming she cried only once over a photo of Rio as a teenager while she was sketching it for the murder board, and you can kind of see it here in the distance there. So Lopez actually drew inspiration for the accessories to an eviction event from her mentor and friend Martha Rossler, who first began performing garage sales inside museums in 1973. And so here you can see the earlier version in 1973 and the most recent iteration, not just monumental garage sale, but meta monumental garage sale at the Museum of Modern Art, right? Rossler is very clever and very smart. She's done many iterations of this garage sale, and she typically curates the objects with items that she has personally collected alongside with calls for other people to donate goods. And then by placing these secondhand objects inside the museum, Rossler transforms her goods into museum artifacts. Or does she, right? So sort of asking audiences, where is the line between the garage sale, the museum, the artifact, or the secondhand object or vintage goods? Lopez's decision to title her sale Accessories to an Eviction purposefully marked the ways this sale was not voluntary. As she remarked at the time, I find that in the eviction and in the moving, I have to get rid of a lot of stuff that I truly love. While Rossler's garage sales have reflected a more playful letting go of goods, perhaps to replace with more goods, right? Lopez's eviction sale represented her economic crisis, her inability to keep the things she loved. Rossler has suggested that in her performance, the portrait of the artist became, and this is Rossler speaking about her work, the portrait of the artist became reframed as the arrangement of her personal things, a metaphoric representation of the mind, exposing the dubious proposition that one is what one appears to own. Certainly we think about that in sort of our consumer culture. In Lopez's case, there was a slight but fundamental variation, as the artist also became what she was forced to sell. As one participant reported, it was sad for anyone who knew the motivation for the event. At the same time, as a garage sale, it was a vintage treasure trove. Right? Haggling was overheard between strangers over a ceramic cat, but the price was firm and the price was met. And I also just maybe wanted to bring your attention to this, in terms of thinking about reflections of what we own and what we know. This is a detail from the collection of neckties that Yolanda had been collecting for many years, and she would sometimes wear them because she liked to sort of fight against the gender dynamics of certain clothing. So that was why she even had that collection. In August of 2015, Lopez attained a reprieve from her eviction when the nonprofit Mission Economic Development Agency intervened by purchasing her building. So we can think about that as, those opportunities for intervention. Nonetheless, the trauma has indelibly shaped her consciousness and her art. I open with Accessories to an Eviction as a starting point to meditate on the ways that the threat of eviction is both similar and different from past forms of trauma and displacement. So part of the objective of my book was to present a longer history of displacement for Latino culture, art, and history, and presence too, right? So I offer an expansive study of Latino art and politics over several decades, and especially focusing on the Mission District as an important sort of geographical intersection for this work. My objective for today is to synthesize this past as briefly as I can, but I did decide that I was going to do it in 4 parts, and usually I try 3, so 4 is just really pushing it with you guys. I hope you can be patient. But I wanted to first maybe address a little early history, talking about the Latin Quarter and sort of thinking about the politics of displacement there. Second, I wanted to think about the politics of placement during the late 1960s and 70s in terms of the creation of arts organizations in the mission and how that worked and why that was important. Third, I would like to turn to Dia de los Muertos as an event, an upcoming event, and thinking about what that event has meant in the mission and how it changed over time, and especially in the 1980s, how it became a site for mourning of issues of not just eviction, but death and loss, and sort of thinking about how art has come as an important element to handling some of this loss and trauma. And finally, returning back to this theme of eviction and gentrification, and sort of maybe trying to bring things together in some way. And so first I thought I would open and talk about the Latin Quarter. This is a map that I included in my book that for me was just fascinating, because growing up in San Francisco, I had no idea that there could have been any other Latino barrio other than the Mission District. I mean, it was really surprising to me. And then sort of turning and doing some research and learning more, and really struggling with the fact that the barrio that I was looking at was also right at this intersection of Columbus and Broadway, which is so famous for people, right? Because that's where City Lights Books is, that's where North Beach is, that's where the Red Light District is, Chinatown, and Little Italy, right? So sort of thinking about, like, how do we know all of these other stories about this space, but we don't know that it actually had from at least the 1880s, 1890s into the 1930s and 1940s was the center of Latin Quarter life. There was the church right there, a sort of cultural center there, a Mexican grocery, several different restaurants, a couple of bookstores, music stores, a theater, right, that showed Spanish language films, and trying to sort of reckon with that particular history. I didn't have the space to include material like this in my book, so I get to show it to you here, which is always fun. And so showing you, like, this is the July 20th, 1890 San Francisco Chronicle, showing you Little Mexico, right? And so specifically talking about this area that I just showed you. Also maybe noting, yes, that in 1896, the Board of Health had marked this particular area as a place that needed cleansing, right? And so certain sections of the Latin Quarter have been found to surpass even Chinatown in filth. And that section will also receive the attention of the health officers, whatever that means, right? And so if we want to think about evictions, displacement, sort of like that earlier history, or thinking about native daughters of Telegraph Hill, those do not look like the native daughters of Telegraph Hill that I typically see as sort of elite history of San Francisco. They look like indigenous women to me. Or thinking about the history of Hinckley Alley behind what was then the jail on Broadway, and the ways in which there was a little Mexican barrio right behind that jail, right behind the jail. And sort of thinking about even later in 1907, the ways in which there was the Sunday night baile of the Spanish colony in San Francisco, and all of these social spaces that were in this particular area. Or thinking about the impact of the San Francisco earthquake, a very famous disaster of 1906, right? And thinking about, well, what happened then? Where did people go? What was their situation? I've done a lot of work looking at disasters, and I'm always struck by, when I look at the history of San Francisco, all the photographs of the people experiencing the disaster are white people. And so I constantly wonder, where are the people of color in this scenario? Well, in this particular situation, we can turn to the Church of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, right at 906 Broadway, and the church was damaged, right? It was actually destroyed and it had to be rebuilt. But in the meantime, people were living in the wreckage area, and there was basically a little community existing there. And maybe drawing your attention to the Teatro Verga, also on Broadway. So here you can sort of see the outer building. I believe it kind of existed in a multilingual world in which it would also be Italian, but showing Spanish language films, as you can see, and therefore in the Spanish newspaper that was also right here in this neighborhood of Imparcial, marketing itself as en el corazón del barrio Latino, right? So again, 644 Broadway, the heart of the Latino community in San Francisco, whether anyone remembers. And maybe finally also in terms of setting forth the Latin Quarter, introducing you to some of the nightclubs that were also setting up in this space. And part of the reason I became so fascinated with these nightclubs was the ways in which they set up, the ways in which Latino cultures could be commodified through this space, right? So on the one hand, they were very important in terms of thinking about the ways in which artists and musicians could actually, musicians especially, I point to, could find work in these spaces. And I would point to a lot of Latin jazz that was happening in this area sort of later on as a result of having these nightclubs in the area. La Fiesta was actually a bay in Columbus. Joaquin Garay actually ran the Copacabana Club for several years, not too far away. I always was fascinated by the 831 Broadway space, which hosted multiple nightclubs over many years. The name just kept changing over time. And so thinking about, who was performing there, who was working there, who was going, who was listening, and sort of bearing all of this history in mind, and also then sort of reckoning with, what do we know about this space, or why do we celebrate these other histories of this particular neighborhood, but this just disappears and it vanishes? One of the questions that I sometimes get asked is like, well, what happened? Where did people go? Why did they leave, right? And I don't think that there's an easy answer to that, because it didn't happen in the same way. I think in the case of nightclubs, we can actually turn to a change in the economics post-World War II. A lot of people were not going to nightclubs as much, and so that was contributing. But also because we had such a tourist mecca being created out of the beats, right? Everyone wants to go to the coffee houses over in North Beach, and what is that going to do? It's going to raise the property values, the property taxes, and what is that going to do? It's going to cause people that can't afford to stay there anymore to move to other places. So one of the things that I do point out is that there are a couple of businesses that do relocate in the Mission, interestingly enough, right? So showing that there is some way of flow of Latinization towards the Mission from this space, along with increasing immigration from Latin America. And so that would be some of the things that I might want to draw our attention to in sort of my part one, right, of thinking about a history of displacement and thinking about a longer trajectory of evictions, whether or not they're called that. Next, I would like to sort of maybe cover some of the ways in which how did artists mobilize in the mission, right? And sort of thinking about the creation of so many Pan-Latino arts organizations in the mission, and why did that happen? And thinking about, of course, we had a sort of larger push through the Chicano Movement with a Plan de Aslan, right, which stated, we must ensure that our writers, poets, musicians, and artists produce literature and art that is appealing to our people and relates to our revolutionary culture, right? And that was declared in 1969, and you can sort of see in the zeitgeist there's this tremendous push to make space for art because the political dimensions of art are very clear. It's a way of speaking, it's a way of protesting, it's a way of talking back. Similarly, we can also start to look at the Latinization of San Francisco. So in 1960, San Francisco counted about 51,000 Hispanics, or about 7% of the city's population, right? By 1970, the numbers practically doubled to 100,000, or about 14% of the city's population. So, I mean, doubling, it's not like 14% is huge, but when you're talking about a population doubling like that, that does seem significant. And then pointing out even more, by 1970, Hispanics comprised 45% of the Mission District population, right? Which is really astonishing just in terms of thinking about the kind of segregation that was happening through that process, right? That there was a tremendous migration, and there was also a tremendous construction of understanding where Latinos live in the city, and it was clearly in the mission. The mission's cheaper rents, the steady increase of goods and services geared to Spanish-speaking immigrants and natives, and attracted low-income residents along with some factory labor, but that was also already disappearing at that point. The mission's real estate market provided primarily rented apartment space, right? Such an important fact about its history. And the post-war white flight, right? All those folks that didn't want an apartment, they wanted that house in the suburbs, basically contributed to a period of extended economic decline. So while Latinos represented 14% of the population, we can also think about the fact that few Latinos served as employees of city art institutions. And so Francisco Camplis, a very clever artist, did his own survey in 1972, and according to him, he looked at he calculated 136 positions at the San Francisco Museum of Art, the De Young Museum of Art, and the Legion of Honor. 2 out of the 136 were Latinos, as far as he could tell from his survey. And so you can also think about the dynamics of what does it mean to try to move into this art world, this deeply segregated art world. And I'll call on Renee Yanez, who is a very respected artist and curator now, but at the time, he went around and he said, what I found out taking portfolios around, slides around, people weren't used to Chicanos or Latinos approaching a gallery. They would go, wait a minute. You know, when I worked at the neighborhood arts program one time, I went to a gallery association meeting and they were very resistant even to look at slides, look at work. And these instances came up with other people. Yeah, I experienced the same thing. And so he says, well, why don't we start our own gallery instead of knocking on doors? And the doors they're not even answering. So you can start to see the generative possibilities of this approach, right? Similarly, and I'd just like to add this story because it's so offensive, artist Peter Rodriguez, who founded San Francisco's Mexican Museum in 1975, went to visit the National Portrait Gallery and discovered they had no portraits of Mexican Americans. And in asking the curator, why are there no Mexican Americans here in the National Portrait Gallery, he was told, we don't show foreigners here. Right? And so sort of thinking about that is the 1970s art world, right? That's the National Portrait Gallery, our capital, DC, right? These formidable social barricades forced alternative trajectories. Latino artists and activists organized to create pan-Latino arts organizations in the mission, and they were able to do so because the value of the property was so low, right? Part of being able to create these spaces was that it was relatively affordable to be in this space because nobody else cared about it. So the rise of these alternative art galleries actually did have a sort of model history through the history of the beats and the counterculture and all those coffee houses in North Beach, and Latinos were also participating in that, and that was also a contributing factor in terms of thinking about why these Latino arts organizations were, able to sort of follow each other. I thought I would just introduce you to a couple of and sort of thinking about Casa Hispana as one of the first arts organizations really focused on art in the Mission District. There were other organizing groups, and thinking about the ways in which it opened in 1966. It was actually really, it was started in a restaurant, right? But they found space. And they did all these performances that were very Spanish in flavor, and I think that made them a slightly more conservative entity to some of the other organizations that were to start. And so you can think that they were doing flamenco dancing, right, and they were performing Spanish plays. But I would point out that, some of those Spanish plays were quite revolutionary that they were putting on. Thinking about Carlos Luarca and his work as a Guatemalan in this space, and the ways in which Casa Hispana was mostly founded by Latin Americans as opposed to Chicanos, which is just an interesting point to note. But it becomes the seed organization for what comes next. So Arte Seis is the next iteration. It actually locates very close to Dolores Park. It doesn't last very long, but it has an interest in avant-garde work. It does feature much more Chicanos, including Graciela Carrillo, Rene Yanez, Lorenza Camplis, and so sort of thinking about the dynamics of place and Latino sort of politics and diversity, or thinking about who's working where, right? But also thinking that Arte Seis is very small, and it's a small space, it's not sufficient, but it attracts a lot of interest, and basically contributes to the founding of what we know today, many of us, as Galleria de la Raza, which opens in 1970. And I thought some of you might appreciate seeing the initial building that Galleria de la Raza was housed in. They took a picture of it in 1988, not very far away. And you can see the windows are totally busted. 1988. You would not see that today, right? But you can see Galleria de la Raza sort of still printed on the building. And you can also see that it was very male-oriented as a space. It was really about 15 to 25 men claimed founding, the Galleria de la Raza. And sort of thinking about the politics of what that meant for women artists.
Where was it?
Sorry?
Where was it?
The original Galleria de la Raza?
Yeah.
It's on the map. Here, let me see if I can.
Valencia Street.
So the current one is right around here, right? And I think the original one, if I'm remembering correctly, is sort of up here, over near 14th Street.
And where is it today? I saw you pointing.
Oh, sorry. So 24th and Bryant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Sorry. All right. And so I think one of the things that I wanted to put forward here, right, in this sort of wrapping up the second part, is thinking about the importance of space, right? Thinking about the importance of locating in the space, of having these spaces, and how fundamental they were to being able to talk, right, to speak out against some of these other social inequalities. And then turning to the third part that I would put forward is thinking about the ways in which a lot of things changed in the 1980s in San Francisco for a lot of different reasons, but especially with the presence of HIV or AIDS. And as Richard Rodriguez Cisco, death has become as routine an explanation for disappearance as Mayflower van lines. Most obviously, AIDS devastated the city. Between 1981 and 1986, so in those early years, there were about 1,500 AIDS-related deaths, but by 1995, the city cited 22,000 cases and about 14,000 deaths. I mean, for such a small city, that's a lot of people, right? That's a lot of people that are dying in the city, and sort of thinking about the politics of this epidemic and the ways in which this is causing people to think about death and mourning and protest, especially in the context of the government of the time. So as the epidemic grew, residents sought ways of coping with the trauma, including candlelight vigils, public memorials, and cultural production. In addition, many in the city also mourned, as if there wasn't enough sadness, also mourned the devastating impact of thousands of desaparecidos in El Salvador and Guatemala, right? And this is a later altar, but I just wanted to bring it forward because I think it's so powerful. This is Victor Cartagena's homage to Roque Dalton that he actually did in 2002. I mean, I think it's such a powerful way of communicating the sense of the disappeared, as he collected 10,500 passport photographs from El Salvador and pinned with a single nail each one to the wall, very carefully measuring each one out so that you had a room full of these passport photographs, and then you had the sound. He had a poem by Roque Dalton playing through the room, and you could sit and hear and think and process. And so sort of thinking about the ways in which artists like Victor Cartagena, he migrated from El Salvador, are processing this directly, but also, San Franciscans are processing this through all the Central American population that is in this city, and sort of there's a first-hand sort of sense of the ways in which these revolutions or mass murders abroad are definitely being felt in San Francisco. And this, of course, is raising the importance of mourning, right? Raising the importance of thinking about how do you mourn such loss. And so thinking about the importance of Day of the Dead as a cultural nexus for mourning in 1980 San Francisco. And I would point out that the Latino arts community in San Francisco already had popularized the event in the 1970s as a way of acknowledging ethnic traditions and inspiring artistic expression. And so one of the artists who was teaching or training a lot of Latino artists about the history of Day of the Dead was Yolanda Garfias-Wu. And here you can sort of think about that in the context of this is the altar that she created within the Dion Museum. She actually did two versions, 1975, 1976. I think this is from the 1975 version. And she was invited by the museum to come in and do an altar. She brought in her materials and she had set them there. And I think it says something about the museum that they then decided to set it up for her. Right? And sort of basically displacing the artist or presuming that anyone could create the scene. And so, first she she found her center. And then she's like, no. And then she redid it, right? And then, of course, they were like, oh. But an indication of how difficult it could be to be working in a museum that simply did not understand the work that you were doing. Right? Though a religious celebration, which it is, it's a spiritual event for Day of the Dead, both to remember but also to celebrate, right, those that we have lost. It also has a history of enabling pundit free speech, and that is especially noted through artists like Jose Guadalupe Posada and his print that would really often make fun of the elite in a lot of different ways. And so the politicizing of the event through his Calavera skeleton images that annually poked fun at those elite and reminding everyone that no matter how wealthy or privileged, no one escapes death, right? So San Francisco artists use their wit to turn these things around. So for instance, Rene Castro's 1989 Burn Baby Burn altar here is featuring a skeleton, and you can see, like, this looks nothing like Garfias Wu's altar, right? You know, you can see the ways in which these artists are just pushing at the possibilities such that it is also starting to look a little bit more like conceptual art or installation work. And you know, for some this is causing concern. I think for Garfias Wu it actually does cause some serious concern because she's worried about, well, where do you see the tradition, right? In this case, you can start to think about Castro's skeleton with an American flag draped over his shoulders and flames looking at his legs. The text written behind him declared, "When you reach my age, you don't need to be walking around burning flags." The caustic Calavera humorously conveyed the role the living needed to play in critiquing American politics, since it was too late for the dead, right? And in this way, San Francisco cultural workers increasingly use Day of the Dead to dramatize the necessity of local and global activism. So, of course, as this celebration moved from the intimate familial events to large-scale public altars, you can start to think about the ways in which this is also going to create other kinds of tensions and concerns, certainly about issues of commodification of the event or cultural appropriation or gentrification, something we could perhaps talk about more. The popularization of Dia de los Muertos radically changed the trajectory of the celebration, right? But it also signaled the way that Latino artists in San Francisco made this event a highly visible illustration of their politics. And so I became very curious about when did artists start actually acknowledging AIDS in the community. And the first altar that I was able to find was by Juan Pablo Gutierrez. And so, and of course you can also start to think about, this of course does not look like a traditional altar. It's a bifold sort of wall with a couple of saints on either side actually, and a poem in the back. Talking about, while society turns its back, we die by thousands and thousands and thousands, right? And works such as this show how ofrendas became a powerful medium to mourn, as well as to demand activism. The work generated both positive and negative responses, right? So Gutierrez recalled, and this is him speaking, "The Latino community was not ready, but Rene Yanez, who curated the exhibition that year, took the chance in allowing us to do the installation. He got a lot of flack from various sources who wanted it removed from the exhibit, but he decided to keep it in the exhibition after a Latino couple, a husband and wife, knelt crying in front of the installation since their young teenage son had just died of AIDS. It was after this particular incident that Rene also decided to include as part of the billboard outside Latinos who have died from AIDS or SIDA, right? And so sort of thinking about this is also part of an important issue of visibility and invisibility. Horacio Roque Ramirez pointed out that the first obituary for a Latino gay man in the Bay Area Reporter appeared in February 1984. Roque Ramirez's important archival work shows the ways that Latinos struggled with this disease, but their deaths often remained invisible in larger dialogues about AIDS. And so I sort of wanted to bring this in again in this conversation about displacement, about eviction, about loss, and thinking also about the ways in which these altars, these works became very important spaces to speak back and to talk. Mourning for AIDS became a prominent public activity over the course of the late 1980s, evidenced by the candlelight vigil of 1983, the AIDS quilt started in 1985, Art Against AIDS started in 1987, and A Day Without Art in 1989. And so there was this kind of culture of mourning as activism, and sort of thinking about the ways in which we have engaged with that maybe now or continue to. And of course, also perhaps worth mentioning the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who were also fundamental in sort of helping us think about mourning publicly. So here, I'm going to turn to sort of my last part and talking about part 4 and returning to evictions or thinking about gentrification, maybe transferring to a work by Chicano called Chains and Flames from 1994, thinking about the ways in which this work, he's clearly lifting off of Picasso's Guernica, a very famous work, but he has turned it into the torment of gentrification with people in cuffs near buildings, and it's, you know, it is a deep cry about the status of the community in 1994. All right. So the gap between rich and poor, according to one source in San Francisco, increased 40% between 1994 and 1996. Over the next several years, as many of you are aware firsthand, San Francisco's income inequality continued to rise while affordable housing vanished. Artists John Leaños and Rene Garcia sought to illustrate the devastating impact of this economic turn in a series of posters designed for the San Francisco Arts Commission in the year 2000. Yeah. The artists crafted a total of 6 posters for use in Market Street kiosks, maybe many of you saw them, that would visually mark longer histories of cultural displacement. So the posters spoke to the history of the Ohlone natives, which you can see on the right-hand side, that one. The enslavement of indigenous people, the Chinese Exclusionary Act, Japanese internment, the crackdown on lowriders on Mission Street in the early 80s, and the current gentrification struggle posed as, or what they titled Y2K, and I hope you can sort of make it out. This was the Y2K poster. You can see the image of the Gap, historicalamnesia.com, a couple of other sort of corporate logos in there. I mean, it's a city in a state of siege or disaster, lifting off the term Y2K for the fear of what was going to happen to computers after, you know, we turned into the millennium. The Art Commission rejected the Y2K poster. They did not reject any of the other posters. Leaños, the artist, hypothesizes. Sorry?
Can you clarify for me which one did they reject?
One on the left.
This one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one.
Yeah.
Thank you for helping.
Sure, of course. So the one about gentrification is the one that they rejected. And Leaños hypothesizes that it was perhaps partly due to some of the corporate logos, including Gap and Sony, right? Maybe that's part of it. But Leaños reported back, you know, so these are Leaños' words as opposed to the San Francisco Art Commission. They said that the atrocities we delineated in the other posters were not comparable to what's happening now. And that's a very political statement coming from the economic elite. And in the entire 5-year history of the kiosk projects, the commission has never objected to anything. But for these, they scrutinized them. And unfortunately, the artists weren't involved in the discussion. So, you know, certainly any of us that know art know that commissions fail sometimes, but there's something really notable about the ways in which this one poster could not be revealed or could not be shown, right? And what was that? Why was it okay to show the crackdown on lowriders in the Mission, but not Y2K, right? And so maybe, you know, because the crackdown on lowriders in the Mission somehow did match internment politics, or what is going on to sort of think, okay, well, the crackdown against lowriders, that happened in the past. Nobody is participating in that, right? But we're all participating in Y2K, and the Art Commission itself might actually be indicted in some way as a participant in this particular set of events. And so therefore, this was not an acceptable poster. In fact, just to give, again, maybe some reflection on arts in San Francisco in the late 80s and early 90s, a 1988 report on arts institutions highlighted the pervasive and long-standing patterns of discrimination in San Francisco's art institutions. So it didn't get better, right? In 1972, I talked to you about the few positions. In 1987, the city's 7 largest arts organizations had a total of 341 board members, 329 of whom were white, or 96.5%, right? These 7 institutions employed 2,600 people, of whom about 2,400, or 91.5%, were white. Non-white employees at these institutions were concentrated for the most part in security, janitorial, bookkeeping, receptionist positions rather than artistic, managerial, or technical jobs. The imbalance of power, or what I would call willful neglect, showed little change from Preface's 1972 survey of employment. So, meanwhile, we did have other spaces that would welcome these conversations about Y2K, and so Galleria de la Raza easily gave John Leaño space to put up a billboard on the gallery talking to these issues of displacement. And perhaps the point here is to emphasize the way that these alternate spaces provided critical physical spaces to represent the disenfranchised. The absence of these spaces, the eviction of people from these places of community, is not simply about losing homes, but about how de facto segregation will continue to be facilitated. Right? Some argue that gentrification is inevitable and that those who protest are simply out of step. And this, for me, is specious logic. As Nancy Mirabal stated, by casting gentrification as primarily an economic byproduct of a growing economy, .com or otherwise, it is possible to avoid, even ignore, questions of difference and the role they play in the disposability of certain populations and the privileging of others. And I would say, if corporate welfare can exist, then the possibility for legal protections for the most vulnerable is possible. Right? The perception that residents have simply failed to properly acquire property in the city or work hard enough to stay in the city is a view that perpetuates a cycle of social violence. Protesters of this new economy highlighted the way gentrification served as a form of neoliberal ethnic cleansing. And so I would give you John Leaños and Jaime Cortez, Gerardo Cortez, and Pablo Pilar's essay, The Last Mexican, or One Last Mexican Discovered in the Mission District, was their billboard for Galleria de la Raza, also in the year 2000, featuring a blow-up of a local newspaper and essay hiding in the cactus, partially obscured by a large leather boot, right? Highlighting the power of the tech industry, the article explained that essay and 2 friends were all unhoused when their space was reclassified from an apartment to an e-apartment, whatever that would mean, right? The artist played on the true history of Ishi, an indigenous man forced to live out his life under anthropological study, as they described how essay must go live under observation at the UC Department of Cultural Anthropology, so anthropologists could record the traits of this last Mexican. Their exaggeration draws, of course, on a disturbing trend. So while researchers predicted that people of color will continue to be the demographic majority in the Bay Area, they also predicted San Francisco will have a non-Hispanic white majority by 2040. Okay, and that's just astonishing to think of a city that's been so diverse in the ways in which this has actually formed some sort of ethnic cleansing. The struggles of residents living in poverty are hard to reconcile with San Francisco's expanding wealth. The influx of highly educated tech company employees has skewed the city's economy, perhaps most evident in the fact that households earning over $200,000 a year more than tripled between 1990 and 2010. So also, I think a point worth noting here, when compared to Los Angeles, Chicago, or New York, San Francisco's smaller population showed a higher density of very wealthy people. I can't give you the numbers, but I mean, we get the idea, right? In a nutshell, the city that once modeled civil rights organizing is now the model of income inequality. And that is just staggering to think about how this has happened. And I could end there and say like, okay, well, we're done, right? But I'm not going to, because I also think that, that's just not a good place to end, right? And it doesn't acknowledge all the work that has been done and all the work that continues to be done and all the ways in which, these spaces do continue to exist, yes, under enormous stress, but we also have to think about the ways in which things like a clever protest out of accessories to an eviction, or the art of Dia de los Muertos, or these alternate spaces do talk back to the politics of these social inequalities and do help us think about other possibilities. The caustic humor of somebody like Rio Yanez can be helpful. He took an image of Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes and used it for his eviction garage sale. He's the son of Yolanda Lopez, where I started with accessories to an eviction. And what I found really funny about his sign was, of course, Bill Waterston actually was using Chagrin Falls, Ohio as the framework for his town here. And Rio Yanez just changed it slightly so that you can see Giant Value and the New Mission Theater right here to show the ways in which Calvin is rampaging like Godzilla through the Mission District, right? He's, smoke curls from a building in his wake, while Calvin mercilessly holds another building aloft in the air, ready to do certain harm. Yanez's minor change to the scene creates a sense of place, but also reminded viewers of the radical redevelopment transforming this block of Mission Street between 21st and 22nd Streets. By the time of this poster, the Giant Value store already had closed to make way for a monumental mixed-use condominium project. And so, sort of looking at the history of these spaces, this is probably the most familiar sort of iteration, or this one for Rio Yanez, 1975 photo of Giant Value in the New Mission. It was initially Hale's department store in the 1950s, and here, of course, are the new condos that have completely displaced that Giant Value, but also architecturally speak of a completely different community that is being represented in the area, and I'm sure we could also talk about that. Philip Lesser, president of the Business Improvement District for this block of Mission Street, declared the New Mission redevelopment project far and away the most impactful project that the Mission has seen in decades. And then he hopes the street can return to its glory days when it was known as the Mission Miracle Mile Shopping District. There was a reason it was called the Mission Miracle Mile, he said. It brought a lot of activity to the quarter. What people have been seeing is a shell of what it was. And Lesser's glory days obliquely skip over the Latinization, not unlike the logic of make America great again, right? As if nothing of value transpired in those years. Yanez might lead us to think otherwise as we consider this mural, my sort of last image here, of Ghetto Frida's mission memories. And you can see Frida, the New Mission Tower right behind her, Giant Value. He did this in 2009 before all of this development had taken place. But for him, he says, the icons and common history of the Mission District that I grew up in is quickly fading from the consciousness of those that now live here. My intention with Ghetto Frida's Mission Memories was to create an accessible documentation of that history. Of course, Yanez's Ghetto Frida makes mischief with Mission history. I mean, there was no Ghetto Frida, right? But he has put her in this place to also sort of spur questions and to ask us to think about who we see and who we don't see in this Mission landscape, much in that question of like, are you just going to return to the Mission Miracle Mile, or might you also start to glimpse and see some of the things that have also transpired here? Do viewers see Frida or a gangster? Can viewers see the artists in the Mission, or do they just vanish into the iconography of ghetto life? Okay. These acts of visual protest ask us to see the world differently. And the artists who have fought for space and voice in the Mission have created a fierce and visible community that has, I hope, taught future generations to speak and to remember. So I will leave it there. Thank you.